Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I think some people are probably still joining in as I start to speak here. Thank you very much for joining us today and finding time in your calendars, 9 a.m. on a Monday morning. I know that's a rough transition from the weekend. As I do the introduction here, please feel free to jot down your name and the company organization you come from in the chat function. I always think it's a really nice way for everyone to know who's on the webinar and for us all to kind of get to know each other a little bit as we go along. We're super excited to have this webinar today. My name is Sven Beyersdorff. I'm a partner at Nordic Sustainability, and I will say a little bit more about who we are at Nordic Sustainability in a second. But today is all about the Omnibus and what we think it means for corporate sustainability. Of course, it feels like the last months have been all about the Omnibus, but now we have a little bit more clarity about what at least is suggested. So I look forward to going through that with two wonderful speakers that we've had been lucky to be able to invite to the webinar. We have, on the one hand, Andreas Rasche, who's professor and associate dean at the Copenhagen Business School. Andreas has a long-standing history in the field of sustainability, an expert on CSRD, and I think possibly the person on the internet who's written most about the CSRD and the Omnibus developments. Luckily, it's not just most, but it's also in my ways often been the most useful insights into the process. So thank you so much, Andreas, for all the effort, and super excited to have you and your knowledge part of the call today.
Thank you very much indeed, Sven.
Thanks. And then we have Mads. Mads is advisor for ESG and strategic initiatives at the Danish Industri Association here in Denmark. Mads, you're leading Dansk Industri's Omnibus task force. So you're the one that, together with your colleagues, of course, is coordinating with the Danish government and the leaderships of the different companies. And that's why I'm super excited to have you on board as well, to really get that perspective of what's going on in of course, the boardrooms, what's going on in the Danish ministry, what is the sentiment of where this is going. Thank you for joining, Mads.
Thank you.
Super. And I see people are rolling with names and organizations, so that's great to see. Before we go into the agenda and get kickstarted, just for those who don't know us, I think we have a lot of new people joining this webinar this time. We are a Copenhagen-based sustainability strategy consultancy. We are around 50 consultants on a mission to really integrate sustainability into what companies do. We do sustainability strategy work with our clients. We help them on climate and transition plan work. We also work a lot in the ESG reporting space, as the entire industry does right now. And we've been lucky to be working with many of the leading companies here in Denmark, but also across Europe, and have been at the forefront also, at least in the Danish field, but I think also across Europe, in implementing CSRD and helping companies advise on the space. So those a few words on us, and with that, I'll get to the agenda. What we'll touch upon today. After my opening remarks, I'll take you through a couple of slides with some of the key changes that we see coming from the proposal from the EU Commission. And then we'll have, luckily, Andreas and Mads comment on some of those changes, the certainty around that, the timeline, some of the things that might be the biggest or the more controversial points for this others that they expect to go through, and we'll cover this. I think it's important for me to say that while we are going to take you through the changes, this is not supposed to be a webinar where we take you through every change in detail. And that's, of course, simply because right now, what we see in front of us is a proposal from the EU Commission, and everything that's in it still has to go through the official processes. So a lot of the details might still be adjusted and changed. So instead, we want to talk about the general spirit of the legislation, what the implications are for companies and the sustainability field more widely. And I know we've all, or many of us, have gone through some difficult weeks and months here with mixed emotions. We discussed this briefly also ahead of the, everyone else joining, Andreas and Mads, where it seems like there's elements here where we might be taking a step backwards in the agenda, but otherwise other elements where it might also be positive and leave more room for things to for us to address the impacts we actually have as companies and find more business value out of that. So I look forward to discussing that as well, and where we can be positive for the agenda and bring, I think, some renewed energy into it. And that's, of course, also the kinds of questions we hope to get from you as well in the Q&A session. So do feel free to ask questions along the way, because we'll have a panel discussion and Q&A time at the end. Now, as you all know, I think everyone's pretty proficient at Zoom by now, but feel free to ask questions as we go along. One of my colleagues, Bea, is going to answer some of the more technical questions as we go along, and then we'll take other questions as part of the Q&A as well. So feel free, and I hope you're active in the chat. Of course, this webinar is also recorded and will be put online. And of course, we'll also share all slides that we're using here today with you afterwards. Yeah, with that being said, I'm just going to go ahead and get started and jump right into what the Omnibus changes are before asking Andreas and Mads to comment on that. In a nutshell, of course, I think many of you are aware that the EU Commission has basically said that from a perspective of reducing administrative costs and creating and ensuring that there's competitiveness for European industries, we need to reduce the reporting demands. And the headlines for us at Nordic Sustainability are that there's overall a drastic reduction of companies in scope of the mandatory sustainability reporting. So we see that approximately 80% of the companies that had to report before are now removed from the scope of the CSRD and the EU taxonomy, which basically means only companies over 1,000 employees are still required to report. We see some weakening in the due diligence requirements that are part of the CSDDD regulation, and I'll go into those in a second. And we also see a reduction in the reporting demands and the reporting granularity. That's in line with the Commission's targets of achieving the 25% reduction of administrative burdens and at least 35% reduction for SMEs. The Commission hopes that this Omnibus package will save around 6 billion euros in costs, in administrative costs, and that it, as I said before, that it supports long-term competitive advantage. We put a question mark there because I think that's one of the discussion points, whether it actually does that or whether it maybe reduces some of the pressure that we think is necessary to also create that kind of change in companies. Now, going through each of the main pieces of legislation, the proposed changes by the Commission in a little bit more detail. On the CSRD and ESRS, what's proposed is basically a 2-year delay for companies that have not reported yet. That's of course the Wave 2 and Wave 3 companies. In line with that, there's an 80% reduction of, as I said already, of the companies that are supposed to report, which would, if that comes through, essentially eliminate the standard Wave 2 and 3 companies. There's also some reductions in the data points that the EU wants to carry out. That is not yet clear what those reductions will be, except that it will be a prioritization on the quantitative data points. We'll also see a removal of the sector-specific standards and a lightening of the assurance requirements, with hopefully more guidance on assurance, which I think has been one of those sticky topics to come in 2026. And lastly, one of the things that I think hasn't got so much discussion yet, but I think is actually quite interesting, there is, I think, a bigger role for the voluntary SME standards, which is the kind of simplified SME level reporting standards, where they are supposed to act as a kind of cap for the kinds of information that companies can ask their suppliers. So that for smaller companies, it's mainly the SME standards that would guide what they should focus on. In terms of the CSDDD, we also see a delay by 1 year for companies to report. We see that there's a reduction in a kind of assessment requirements that companies are supposed to mainly look at the tier 1 or the direct suppliers and only expand beyond looking at those if there's what they call plausible documentation, where before I think it was a much more intense requirement to look at the entire value chain. There's a change of the due diligence assessment cycles where now companies are supposed to do that only every 5 years unless triggered otherwise, instead of the annual review. So that's quite a big change for us. There's some softening in penalties. And one of the also interesting changes for us is the language in the regulation or the suggestion around the climate transition plans, where these have to be merely adopted rather than put into effect. I think we can discuss whether that reduces the pressure of companies to actually act on these climate transition plans. For the EU taxonomy, the changes are also going to then, well, if going through, be worked upon, and the effective date for them to be put into force would be financial year 2027. So until then, the current regulation regime is valid. There would also be a removal of about 80% of the companies on the EU taxonomy, which of course might have quite big implications for the comparability and availability of data that was underlying behind the EU taxonomy for financial investors or other stakeholders. There's some reduction, some simplification in the criteria, especially the do no significant harm criteria. And lastly, one of the important things I want to highlight is that there's a financial materiality threshold set, which basically means that companies that wouldn't have to report on activities that are non-material, those that are constitute less than 10% of their turnover. So overall, some delays and simplifications. I think what's also, and on the positive side for us, interesting though, is that many of the core elements of the regulation remain, right? I think there was some discussions on the CSRD where the double materiality might be carved out and reduced to single materiality, financial materiality only. But it looks like double materiality at least prevails for now. Any of these things can, of course, still change in the process that we're now embarking on, right? But at least this is part of the proposal as of now. Interesting also, the 10 ESRS topical standards remain. So none of the topics, biodiversity, circularity, all the social topics, none of the topics so far seem to be taken out. And companies are still required to take accountability of the whole value chain and the CSRD as well. Under CSRD-DD, the overall scope is unchanged. It still follows a risk-based approach where companies have to focus on those impacts that are most severe, and they still have an obligation to act and on those adverse impacts. Lastly, on the EU taxonomy, there's still a reporting on the eligibility and the alignment of company activities. There's still technical screening and minimum safeguard criteria, and companies will still have to report on the net turnover, CapEx, OpEx, and the green asset ratio. So I think there is, I think, a lot of the principles that stay as well. Now, with this relatively fast run through, and I guess, and again, we'll share the slides afterwards, I wanted to just start by asking you, Andreas, you've been covering this so intensively in the last months, and are one of the experts that really has been covering this process. Is there anything major missing from the summary that I have? Would you place a different emphasis? What are the things that stick out for you?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sven, and welcome everybody to this webinar this morning. Well, I think in terms of content, I think you covered it all. I think what we mentally, I think, need to process here is that it is not just fewer firms, but it is fewer firms doing less reporting. And I think this is this kind of double effect that this Omnibus introduces. So I think this is something noteworthy, and I see a lot of the discussion also in the media are about the scope, but it's also about the amount of data at the end, and this amount of data is very important, particularly for investors. They always look for fine-grained data, so we are losing a lot here. And then my second comment would be, I think we have to recognize that the proposal contains quite a bit of adjustments around what I would call the infrastructure, particularly of the due diligence directive. So they weakened the climate transition plans. This almost goes a bit unnoticed, actually, when this was presented. But it is significant because at the end, they put the so-called put into effect clause, they deleted that out of the CSDDD. So that basically means, firms do not have a strict obligation anymore to operationalize these plans, or at least it is not explicitly fixed in the law. Of course, there is an expectation, but well, it is still not necessarily fixed in the law. And we also have a weakening of the civil liability, the EU-wide civil liability regime under the due diligence regulation. So these infrastructures that are built around the directives, they have been significantly weakened.
Yeah. That's interesting, yeah, and especially the climate transition plans, right? That is also for one of the large ones as well, especially with the uncertainties around the kind of net zero and the climate targets that we see for companies right now. That seems to be a pretty substantial one if that comes through.
Exactly.
Hmm. Mads, we see, of course, the signals of the EU having to now go through this assessment, this process of getting discussing the changes with the European Parliament, then potentially trilogue. But we see mixed signals of how the EU could go about getting this through, taking the traditional approach versus being able to fast track. What do you expect about the kind of process and timeline behind this?
Yeah, so we see, and thank you, Sven, for a very good introduction, and hello, everybody. Yeah, so we see three major roads they take. The stop the clock element will go through a fast track, where we expect that they within a few months will simply agree to stop the clock, which means that, as you said, the second wave and the third wave will be paused, and that means that next year all the companies from the first wave will have to report again. If the rest of the process is not gone through, then some of the targeted adjustments to the taxonomy will go through as delegated acts, which mean the Commission will send out the delegated acts, and then the Parliament and Council have 2 months to adopt that. And then the last part, which is of course the major part, is the whole Omnibus, which will go through the normal process. And that means that the Commission will put out a proposal they have now, then it will have to be discussed in both the Parliament and the Council, and then there will be a lot of negotiations, I think we can expect, and it will probably first be done, I think, sometime in 2026, so it will take 1.5 years, maybe more. So yeah, so that has a longer timeline. Yeah, so there are three major elements.
Yeah. Okay. So you also expect there not to be much more clarity until probably later in 2026 on what the actual changes are.
Yeah.
Also when it comes to the data points, for example, on the CSRD.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Is that also what you see, Andreas?
Yes, I mean, this is basically also, I think I'm very aligned here. I think it's important to everybody on this call to recognize, legally speaking, we have two proposals here. So the one proposal is the stop the clock proposal, which is legally different from the kind of more comprehensive omnibus proposal. So the stop the clock, they will push this through because they have to. We need some sort of legal certainty around that, and everything else would be, I think, not meaningful. I think for the omnibus itself, of course, we will see more extensive discussions, I think, also because when you look at how groups in the European Parliament and so on have reacted already to this. So this can indeed take a significant amount of time, and I would probably kind of expect this 26, maybe mid 26, maybe even more towards the end of 26, to have the entire process completed here.
Yeah, and I think that connects quite well to the question we have on what do you think is the likelihood of the simplification coming through in this severity, right? How can people understand? Is this simply kind of the anchored negotiation position of the EU Commission? And will it be corrected in the Parliament in the process, or do you expect this to actually? And I know we're doing a bit of crystal ball glazing here, right? But what do you think are the wins? Is this largely the way it will go? Or are there key elements that you expect are kind of more up to potentially be watered down again from the EU Commission proposal than others?
Well, I think if I can start here, I mean, if we need to look at the Council, which represents the member states, and the Parliament, which represents the people, so to say. I think in the Council, I do not expect that much pushback, to be honest, because what we see in this proposal, by and large, actually aligns with quite a lot of the positions of the member states. I mean, we all kind of had these discussions on LinkedIn and elsewhere, right, with the leaked letters by Scholz, and everybody leaked something for a couple of weeks. and if you read these letters, I mean, they are by and large aligned with what is proposed here. Only the Spanish position, I think, is probably a bit more moderate. On the other hand, in the council, in COREPER, the Committee of Permanent Representatives, you need a 35% of population-weighted votes against a proposal in order to stop it. So that is actually quite significant. That would require two major economies, maybe France and Germany or something, to come together and stop that. So that I think is rather unlikely. In the parliament, I think we are likely to see some pushback. I'm pretty sure about that. The Socialists, Democrats, but also the Greens, also Renew, the Liberals, they have kind of positions which I would say are not quite compatible here. But then you need to look at the political realities. Where does the majority lie? And I think the European People's Party, the EPP, so the Conservative Party, they are the largest bloc and they will try to organize a majority for that. What worries me a bit is that they might look for votes on the very right-hand side of the parliament. And I think this would also send not a good signal if this should happen in the end. I think we need to get our act together. We need to build bridges here in order to find a consensus, and maybe not on the main parts here. I do not think that this is so likely that, for instance, the scope criteria will be changed again, but on some of the details, maybe some concessions are possible.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Mads, how does that align with your view on, you're also, of course, very connected to the Danish position on this. Would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, but I fully agree with Andreas. I think the council, as he says, is on track with this. I think there will be big debates in the parliament. And as you also said, Andreas, especially we hear from the far right a push to kill the Green Deal. And I guess we could hope that the center is more up for the changes and that they can find a compromise on the middle. Yeah.
But it opens that question whether there could still be kind of a further watering down or reductions, right, in the political process in the next coming months. Do you see there's a good likelihood for this to be watered down even further, or do we think this is kind of the worst case and then we go upwards from there? Worst case, depending on which stance you're on, right?
That's a good question. I think what we heard also from the negotiations in the Commission is there were a push in the Commission for much more radical proposal, and I think that got a pushback. So I think what we've seen from the Commission now is kind of a compromise that I also think they hope most groups can see themselves in to some extent. And as Andreas say, I think the main elements, the scope will probably remain the same, but some of the details might change. There's also discussion about what ESRS data points should be voluntary, which should be mandatory, and so on. And I guess also some of the due diligence changes will be up for discussion.
Okay, good.
Yeah. I think I'm very much aligned with this position. I mean, we will see probably some discussions around, I would be not surprised if some kind of blocks or some people in the parliament or even in the council try to push even further. For instance, what was on the table for a while was the double materiality principle. We all know that it was saved last minute, as I heard. Also, what was on the table was to make the taxonomy completely voluntary, a voluntary system. So the more radical proposal within the Commission contains something like that. But I think a consensus position, politics is always about finding consensus. And I think a consensus position is unlikely to swing in a more radical direction. I think, I hope that the center will get their act together and will work on something meaningful here.
But I mean, we were also in a situation, right, where there was a lot of guidance missing. And I think that also explains much of the frustration of the field, and especially, of course, the leadership of companies. I mean, when we talk to and present double materiality or strategy baselining results to boards or company leadership, then it's the it's the vagueness of some of the guidelines that have been out there so far, right? Is there also a scenario where this could actually, even as if you say, Andreas, it results in a little bit less reporting, that it's clearer reporting that actually makes things more comparable?
Well, I think this less reporting, yes. I'm not sure whether less necessarily means clearer reporting. I think there are two aspects of your question. The first is around guidance, and yes, we need more guidance. That was, I think, one of the cardinal mistakes that was made by the Commission and the EU, that they did not put out enough guidance here. So people were left in the dark, and then kind of a lot of pushback was caused by that. But guidance now, of course, absolutely necessary. We need to push for it, but guidance itself won't do the trick. I think at the end of the day, when we see less data being reported, I don't think this is good, because investors, they want more fine-grained data. This is how investors work, right? So if you only get kind of a very rough assessment, even of a bigger company, then of course this is not good. And some of the smaller companies that will work with a voluntary standard. And during the press conference last Wednesday, I mean, they expressed a lot of hope, that the voluntary standard will kind of act here as a kind of safety net, and a lot of companies will go there. And I think there will be companies that go there, but of course the voluntary standard is not comparable itself to the ESRS. So we lose data, and I think there is a risk that we are flying blind with regard to the Green Deal, at least on the corporate side. So politically speaking, I see this as a risk.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a view there, Mads, on this topic as well? Or?
Yeah, I just want to elaborate a bit, because I also think when we talk about less data, we also need to look at the full ESRS reports that just came out. And I think two of my colleagues went through a lot of them. And I'm just reading a few numbers here that on average, they were 70 pages longer than last year. And if all the companies that were in the scope right now, this would be 160,000 pages of reporting on the CSRD alone in Denmark, and 3.5 million pages across the EU. So there's also a point of what is the right level. And I think who will read, when we talk about transparency and comparability, who will read 3.5 million pages, which often is, of course, some of it is very relevant, but some of it is also very specific and very detailed and very company focused. So yeah. I think from our point of view, there's also the whole element of more quantitative data, and more like a stricter guidance is very necessary.
Yeah, and I think it would be great when we talk about the implications in a bit to differentiate between the amount of reporting and the kind of internal discussions that are also forced by this, right? Because I think that's something we see a lot right now when working with clients, that we think a lot of the kind of process and structures that have been built because of the regulation internally have led to such good discussions, right? That even though the external reporting maybe is too onerous, right? The question for us is, how do we keep that going as we go along, right? But maybe let's go into the kind of implications for the companies and what that means. And I'll just we have a small slide on this where we also go a little bit of a limp, so please don't litigate us afterwards if on this point. But maybe I'll just kind of present our view of the situation, and then it would be great to get your view as well, of course, Andreas and Mads. I think there's three points on the left that are, I think, quite clear and should I think they're good to be restated, but I think they're very straightforward, right? Of course, companies have to consider that they did reporting also for other reasons than just regulatory compliance. You made the point, Andreas, right now that, of course, especially financial stakeholders, I think their eyes have really been awakened to the kind of data they could get from companies and the comparability they could get. And our financial clients, I can definitely see that they're looking to be able to make better decisions based on more data and how they do that differently in the future. I also think, to the point I just made, companies, it feels like we're at the kind of tail end of companies having spent so much effort to understand the impacts, to upgrade their kind of financial risk and opportunity lenses internally, that I think we really have to make sure as a field that we use the kind of information and the knowledge that's been built. And in some ways, maybe the cat is out of the bag internally for many companies, that they've gone through this process, they know the impact. And so that's something, of course, to build on and learn from. And of course, that, I think, for us is really something that should also drive the kind of competitive advantage that the EU wants to see here, right? It's very, very clear to me, having worked in this field for so long, that that's really only strategic integration can provide the competitive advantage we need. And the question I think that we'll have to discuss: are we still pushing for enough strategic integration with the way it's going right now? Then on there's thumbs up. Feel free to use reactions, of course. That's I was in a webinar on Friday where there's a lot of reactions that I think provide a bit of communal spirit in a webinar such as this. So that was very much encouraged. I think the right one is a little bit the right side of this is a little bit our attempt to make this a little bit tangible of what should companies do, right? And Mads, I guess you get these questions all the time, right? Now, if we don't have clarity until 2026 or late 2026, what do we actually do? And we thought, if we ask this question, we of course ask also by our clients. In our view, of course, nobody knows, and companies really have to think about what is the risk of over-preparing versus under-preparing right now, right? And in our view, if you are kind of a company that's smaller, around the 250 employee size, it's probably quite likely that you'd be out of scope given the political signals we see. So we think, pausing CSRD efforts, considering still doing a DMA or the useful elements of this regulation, but otherwise following the VSME standard and for reporting data collection makes sense. For the kind of 500 employee size and above, it's a bit unclear right now, right? I mean, they might well fall out, but even the EU says keep reporting, keep working on it, especially if you're first wave. But of course, there might be elements where you would slow down or try to prioritize in the meantime, right? But it still makes sense around that size to continue with its materiality assessments, understanding the data gaps you have, knowing what takes the most work to gather in terms of data, integrating into financial risk and the business model questions, and of course also consider the effects of the CSDDD, because especially if you're B2B, because you'll likely be asked by the companies you supply to. And of course, there's for companies that are 1,000 employees or over or close to the 1,000 employee threshold, right? Because maybe also there'll be a change of the threshold to 750 employees, under which everything will be cut. We think, and of course, the companies will simply have to continue with the work. Now this is us kind of going on a limb, because we haven't seen similar guidance out there. What do you think about this, Mads? How does the line? And I know you probably can't give a fully certified statement from the Dansk Industri side. How does this reflect the kind of conversations you have right now?
Yeah, but it's very much in line. I think one point is that it looks like the phase one 500 employees might have to report next year again. So they should probably continue, but yeah, maybe slower, and see what will happen in the next few months. But generally, we give the same advice right now. We get a lot of questions, and we're trying our best to guide with what we have. But our main message is continue the work, use the tools of the CSRD, use the DMA, use the whole stakeholder overview and so on, and use it as the foundation and groundwork to continue your work with reporting, even if you fall out or even if you were not even in from the beginning. A lot of our initiatives from DI has been focused on the SMEs. We have a program called Climate Ready. We have ESG in the value chain. We have a lot of ESG kits out in our different business associations, and focusing on those out of scope. And we take them through the whole DMA process. We take them through all the tools that you use if you have to make a full report, and we can still see it creates value even though you didn't have to do a full CSRD report. So I think from us, the main message is, even if you fall out of scope now, there's a reason to continue. And now there's also a chance to, because we also know, and I think you also heard from your clients, that it has been a mouthful. And I think to some extent, for some people, it have ended up, even though there was a lot of energy in the beginning, it ended up being more of a compliance exercise to some extent, at least. And a lot of it was pushed from maybe the sustainability department more to a compliance or finance department. So I think generally keep working on the sustainability impact, and then maybe slow a little down on the reporting side. Yeah.
Mm. And I think this is an interesting point, right? Because I think you're right that we also see that it's become almost overly a compliance exercise. I think the kind of the scare and lacking guidance on the assurance regime probably contributed to that as well. But I just like to ask you, Mads, because while I agree that there's also been over focus on honest reporting, we'll have all these these data points that these additional report pages that we'll have to ingest in some ways. There's this question to me, to what extent are these changes actually simplifying or turning the reporting system kind of into an empty shell of itself, right? And we've discussed some of this already. But what is, I mean, you yourself say many of the underlying elements are useful. What is kind of the view you think in Dansk Industri, but also the Danish government position of these changes, and how do we make sure that kind of overall breadth of the or direction of the regulation keeps being implemented to the way it's thought of?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it differs a lot who you ask and which kind of company you ask, where they are. I think generally what we've seen is that a lot of companies, even bigger ones and even companies that are very far on their sustainable efforts, have found that when they had to implement the full CSRD and the full ESRS reporting, it was much more extensive than they thought it would be, and they also probably haven't got the value out of it they wanted. I think when we look through some of the reports, there's a lot of pages that are very difficult to read, and a lot of it's not when we talk about the purpose being transparency and being communicating what the companies do. I guess the full ESRS is maybe a bit too strict and has too many details that nobody will use. When we looked through the reports, we saw on average they had found 22 impact risks and opportunities, and some companies even had up to 39 IROs. So it's just to say that it's it gets very broad, and I think and of course I know with time and through a new phase of reporting, this would of course be more aligned. And I also think there is a point, of course, in could we have gone on and maybe some of this would have been better with time. But I think there is a strong push right now, as we all know, from the Commission to reduce burdens generally. So yeah, I hope that was an answer.
Thanks. I think we'll go a little bit more deeper into it. Andreas, I know you've also been a little bit more critical on this, right? And we've been following you, and you and I have been having some discussions along this line as well, right? What do you see as the main risks of this? And do you see, where we simply would this have sorted itself out because we're building a new kind of reporting system, just like we used to do on the finance side or the past kind of 100 years, or is there such dramatic changes? What are the risks here?
Well, I think the risks are clearly that we are completely overreacting now, right? I mean, Mads also just said it. I mean, we should have given this some more time. Also, there was an interesting comment over the weekend in the Financial Times where Simon Mundy, one of the people running the section on sustainability, kind of asked, why does the EU change directives which it actually just adopted? I mean, why not give the system a little more time to kind of see where we end up? And I can also say from an academic perspective, we know that these systems need time. Financial reporting took over 100 years to actually come to where it is now. We need to establish routines. We need to develop software solutions. All of this takes some time, also for best practices to develop. So we cannot completely expect, or why do we expect that sustainability doesn't need that, right? I mean, I just don't understand it. So what we see on the political side is pure political opportunism. I think this is what we see on the side, at least on the side of the Commission. So I think, to come back to your question, what do we see here? I think it is a communication challenge for the Commission. They cannot call it deregulation. You cannot put up a big banner and kind of say, hey, well, let's do some deregulation. That doesn't work. So they call it simplification. But I ask also in my LinkedIn post always, if you move 80% of firms out of a directive, how does that simplify? So where is the simplification here, right? I don't think we can talk about simplification, and I think deep down also the commissioners, they know that. Right now we are in a situation where we have about or even fewer firms under scope. If all of this goes through, then under NFRD. So going back to the past is no solution. And this is the big risk here. We have a train back to the past, and this train is not a good train.
Yeah, I think lots of love from the audience here. But I think you're right, Andreas, and I think that there seems to have been a big communication challenges between kind of, I think, the sustainability field and the management of companies as well, right? Where it feels like that this understanding that we're building this management system that has to work out its kinks over the years has just not reached, or that alignment hasn't happened between sustainability departments and management in the field, right? Does that reflect your view as well, Mads, or where do you stand on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we see that right now, after the first reports have gone out, that there might be a disconnect between the senior management and the sustainability departments, where of course everyone working with this is very keen on making it work and have a lot of great experiences now and want to make it even better next year. And then we see a management also politically that see a lot of challenges, geopolitical challenges, economic challenges. And I think it's also a question of prioritization. And I also think I agree with Andreas that the timing is a bit weird. It just came into force. We are in the middle of the first wave. And I think it's important to also state, I don't think the Commission don't see the value of sustainability reporting. Ursula von der Leyen was the president when all these legislation came into force in the first. And so I think this is simply, there's a significant push, both politically, but also geopolitically, to change something in general in the way European legislation is made and the amount of European legislation made. And I think even though right now we only talk about the Omnibus, this is just the first small element of a bigger wave that will come. As you said, Sven, in the beginning, they will reduce reporting obligations by 25% and 35% for SMEs. And maybe this will change, I don't know, 2 or 3%. And it also, from that perspective, if you look at it from the Commission's perspective, you can also say, okay, we have 3 directives that have not, or 2 directives, one that only the first wave have been implemented, and a lot of countries like Germany haven't even implemented it yet. And then we have the triple D that has not yet been implemented. There's several years until it will be implemented. So if your primary goal as a new Commission is to reduce the burdens, it makes sense to start they chose to start here, I would say.
Yeah.
and I think from a political point, I can understand why they chose that. And I also think the Danish government, their position is also from the same point of view. We need to see some changes in the way and the amount of European regulation.
Let's start with sustainability.
Yeah, I think all of us working in this field would prefer the started somewhere else, but I think from like a political point of view, I can see why this was the first omnibus, and they also already announced that they will look at the project regulation, agriculture, digital defense, and so on. So I think we will see this exercise over all kinds of EU regulation, and of course, it's a bit critical, especially for all of us working in this field, that they start here, but I also think we need to understand when we talk about it that it's not because the Commission hate and don't see any value in reporting. I think it's a political choice, and there is a significant push, especially from some of the bigger European nations.
Yeah. And I think there's a big question for us right now, whether this will actually decrease, I think, effort and I think reporting focus in the coming year also, because I think what we also see is that many companies now, of course, are in a limbo again for a year and a half, as we just established, right? And many of our clients now see that they might have to rework substantially what they've already done. So that is also something that I think is a bit strange with of course the necessity of the timelines that changing regulation to this level requires, right? Andreas, do you how do you see the reactions from companies so far on this?
Well, I think it's a mixed bag, to be honest. I have lots of conversations also with practitioners around that, and I think for some of them, I think they play the compliance game, and they will probably walk away from this. But some also ask good questions. And you know what? Last week I had an interesting discussion with a company, and the person said, and I fully agree with this: we need to ask why we report. Why do we do reporting? Why do we do diligence? And I think this should be, before you start with anything else, gather your team around the table and discuss the why. And I think because what we are discussing here are legal changes. And of course, the law can tell us so many things, and it also can tell us so many other things. So I think what we need to do is we need to get back to this why. Because the why is something that can then also drive value within the company. If you just come there with a compliance attitude, and if all of this is a cost burden, it will be a cost burden in the end, right? This is, we know this also from psychological research. These things become self-fulfilling prophecies, and that's why I think this why discussion, we need to have more of that. And my hope would be that a lot of companies will actually go there, maybe precisely because of the omnibus, and maybe this is also, with all the sadness around the omnibus, maybe this is also a positive effect of it, you know, that companies are forced to reinforce why are we doing this? What is the value in this? And where do we want to go long term?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, because I think what also we've been, of course, I think many of us practitioners in the field have been seeing this. We had a client recently that said, I'm so tired of sustainability. It used to be fun. Now it's all just accounting, right? Where I think we've been I think now spending 2 years on reporting accounting without asking the bigger questions, right? And I think especially with the issues we right now have about the climate transition plans of companies, right? That many are running into deep problems of actually making that happen. Focusing on that in the discussion is way more useful, I think, than focusing on more reporting. But the question is, for me, how do we make this happen in this agenda as a field, right? Because I think we all understand that it's a biodiversity crisis. We all understand that we're exceeding planetary boundaries. But still, I think we have yet to really get enough attention or enough focus of companies to actually avert those crises, right? And for me, the question is also, when we now focus more on competitiveness, how do we balance that with actual impact reduction, right? I think with that, maybe that's we'll open the floor to some of the questions from the wider group. I think there's a lot of questions. I think we'll also try, just so everyone knows, we'll also try to answer some of those after the fact and some kind of a summary of some of the main overlapping questions out. But maybe I'll just looking through some of these. I think there's a question around from Chris Lynn about, for those companies who may fall out of scope, how do we keep kind of the necessary reporting and the focus on sustainability on the map, right? How do we make sure it doesn't just drop off the line? Maybe Andreas, would you like to start?
Oh, it's for me, this is all about narratives in the company, right? I mean, companies live out of narrative. If you have a cost narrative, it will be difficult to protect sustainability reporting. If you have a value narrative, if you have a narrative where the company accepts, okay, this is something meaningful, we are not wasting our time here, then I think it will be easier to save it. And then, you know, I think you need to reflect on things like, what can or why is data meaningful? And data is very meaningful for a number of reasons. It helps you to allocate capital. It helps you to manage risks. It also helps you to incentivize people, you know, particularly if you have ESG incentives, ESG related incentives, they need to rest on something in terms of the data infrastructure. So I think this for me is the key point here. Having this narrative in the organization and pushing for it, I think this can help, particularly in the situation that Chris described.
Fully agree. I'm just looking through the list. I think there's the whole the whole ESG value discussion, right? And I see one question about how would you respond to someone who claims that ESG is not worthwhile at the moment due to too many uncertainties and current costs. And I think that links on to what you say, right? Asking the right question. Right? And I think, Mads, you're also discussing a lot at Dansk Industri, probably about your programming, how to focus in the future, right? How do you have a view already on how you try to combine the kind of value but continued impact reduction question?
Great question. I think it's an ongoing discussion right now, but I think, of course, our main message is to keep going, and it will always create value to work with sustainability, either for your business or for your clients or for the planet in general. So I think there is I think, and we could also use the Omnibus as a way to say, okay, now you don't have to worry about all these requirements right now. Now you can actually focus and take a look at your company, take a look at your business, and decide where does it actually make sense to focus right now.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Do you think there's another question here on business trust in EU legislation in the future? Maybe for you, Andreas. How do you think this will affect business trust in legislation? Right, it's taken that a lot of effort, right? Even if now things get adjusted and all this, will we just see such a undermining of trust that'll affect later adoption or of these kinds of standards?
Well, I think we don't know, right? I'm a researcher, so I usually trust in data. So we would need to see the data, but I can say, of course, I think maybe there are two competing effects here. On the one hand, of course, it will probably undercut the trust by some, because I mean, we just discussed this. If you build up something, you send signals to companies, and then, a couple of years later, you say, no, please roll it all back. People are not happy. And you send inconsistent messages. Whenever you send inconsistent messages, this doesn't increase trust. On the other hand, I could also imagine, of course, that the politicians, they want, of course, to be more trusted, particularly by their voters. You know what happened on the day that the Omnibus was presented? The Commission put out a message on Twitter kind of saying, simplification promised, simplification delivered. So they are under pressure. They feel under pressure to deliver for the people who voted for them. And this is one of the reasons why we see this kind of proposal, right? Because they know that with just a kind of omnibus light, they cannot please their audiences that they want to please. So I think the trust question is a question of who you look at and trust by whom into whom. That probably plays a big role.
I think that's a lot of that makes a lot of sense. I think there are also some comments right now about the lack of almost kind of good examples of where ESG data has actually been used to make to create better decision making, right? And I think it relates for me to a question of how we as a field kind of influence this process in the best way, right? Because I think if we are, in my view at least, I think the reporting requirements, at least on the data points of SMEs, could be reduced by 60-70%. But we keep the ones that actually move the needle, and we would be potentially better off and have more focus on how do we then actually go through decarbonization, removing our dependency on, of course, on materials as part of the green transition. But it's for me, it's a question: how do we find more of those types of examples in the field and actually bring them to the Commission and to the discussions? So maybe a question: what do you think sustainability managers can do to actually advocate and be part of this process now as these proposals get discussed and refined? Mads, do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, of course. I can say from our side, we are doing a lot right now to simply find all the good examples and also find all the examples where we can see that sustainability and reporting creates value, even though you are not part of any requirements, and to tell the good stories and to see how it can actually move impact and how it can help the business development. And I think we are doing a lot or a big effort in trying to find all the great examples. And I think generally right now, if you're about to go out of scope, keep telling what you're doing, keep reporting, maybe in a lesser scope, but keep the communication part of it, especially. Yeah.
Mm. Andreas, have you found good avenues where people can get their voices heard?
Well, I think business associations are one, right? I mean, I remember I was having a webinar with Richard Gardner it was like a month ago, and we discussed exactly the same question, right? I mean, how do we get good use cases out there to also change the narrative a bit? Business associations, I think, are one good intermediator here. So I think that certainly is a good way, and probably also we as researchers, and I say this very self-critically, we need to get out there and we need to start, to translate the findings much better into something that can be read by the general public, because there are so many studies out there that show the value of ESG disclosures. They are hidden in journals that are inaccessible, that are full of method, and they are never really translated into something that people can make sense of. So I think this would be something for us to do. We are working on it. It's difficult because we are working within our own constraints of the system, but we are pushing as hard as we can.
Mm. I think that's exactly what I see as well. I think there's such a need for clarity, and I think on the kinds of changes that companies actually need to do. And I think we need to push for that much harder in the field and make sure also with our management we refocus those discussions, right? Because I think we also come from a regime or from a reporting environment where everything was just about the current status quo and maybe being slightly better than the current status quo. And what I'm missing and what CSRD had, I think, the potential to give was the more push of how do we transform this more from the ground up, right? And that is something that I'm most scared about missing right now with the way the discussions are potentially going, right? But we had, I mean, it is interesting because of course the EU also has been putting as part of the Omnibus forward the Clean Industrial Deal, right? Which is supposed to be this roadmap, I think, exactly for the discussions we're just having around how do we do, competitiveness? How do we also get value out of sustainability? How do we, I think, in that way, in their focus, decarbonize, right? Do you think this is a kind of a signal for hope and also that dual ambition of the Commission, or is it, or does it also kind of signal maybe the risk of a much more limited decarbonization approach where a lot of the other topics just fall by the wayside, Andreas?
No, I'm actually quite positive on the Clean Industrial Deal, I must say. And what Wutko Hoekstra presented and colleagues last Wednesday, of course, is I think has many good ideas in there. And this is also still what gives me hope, to be honest. I mean, because if you and maybe also something we need to broaden a bit our view here. Of course, what is there in terms of the omnibus proposal is not proportionate, but there are other proposals out there. Also, the affordable energy plan by Jurgensen that was presented last week as well. Particularly the Clean Industrial Deal, you mentioned it, Sven. I mean, that's really good. You have investments in there, and what we need are investments into these into these sectors, into clean manufacturing in particular. So it's 100 billion euros earmarked for that. The problem is it comes too late. We would have needed that 4 or 5 years ago. We didn't do it. The Americans did the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. The Chinese also did the same, and they were running away. So it comes too late. But overall, I'm actually positive towards the Clean Industrial Deal. Not all of it, but most of it. Also on the issues regarding acceleration of circularity and the Circular Economy Act that they promised for 2026. So I'm very positive here.
Yeah, for me also what stuck out was this also the focus, of course, on the continued focus on the raw materials and kind of joint procurement and the kind of closing the circularity loop, right? At least on being able to reuse some of the materials that we put out into the world. I think that sounds like a really good element as well of something more coordinated. Mads, is that being discussed a lot at Dansk Industri as well? And do companies seem to be jumping on board of this?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think we're also very happy with I agree fully with Andreas. It could have been earlier on. But I also think another point is that it also shows that the Commission is still committed to the EU Green Deal and the goals in that, which also give me general hope when we talk about the reporting that this is a part of the whole Green Deal, but they're still committed to the major goals.
Yeah, I would think the same. Coming up right by the hour now, there's so many questions we didn't get to. We're, as I said again, going to try to cover some of those in kind of a combined form. So Mads, I might also reach out to you on some of the Dansk Industri's views on those. Thank you both so much for the good discussions here. Thank you everyone in the chat for the degree of engagement. I think there was kind of parallel discussions going on left and right. So I think that's also what we need to do here. And I just hope that as a field, we can recenter the discussions here on what reporting is necessary to actually push us and hold us accountable for the kinds of changes we need to do around decarbonization, around biodiversity, around circularity. And I think that's what we should be working for and find some new energy from now that there might be a little bit more limbo on the reporting side for the next months. Thank you again, Andreas and Mads, for joining. Really appreciate it, and hope everyone has a good day.
Thank you very much indeed. It was a pleasure to be with all of you this morning.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.